wanted to start talking about Napoleon, the man who was a leader, a warrior. I wanted to discuss his character, his accomplishments, the influence he had on his contemporary Europe and to our today's world as we know it. But before we dive into that, let's start off with discussing French Revolution, the events that led to it, the state of French society by the time of Napoleon's rise, basically.
Well, thank you so much for having me on your show, on your
Thank
podcast.
you for being here.
I'm delighted. It's a very the question that you pose is both in terms of scope and content is very broad and complex because the French Revolution is one of the most crucial developments that laid the foundation for the modern world, essentially the world that we know, the world that we inhabit, with especially in terms of the social, cultural, political achievements that we take in many ways for granted, are all the byproducts of the revolutionary processes that began in 1789 in France and then spread rather violently across Europe and beyond. In terms of the causes, I mean, there are complex causes of the revolution. Probably financial being among the most important one, and especially I think in terms of parallels with the modern, because I always tell students that history, of course, is very fascinating to study and examine. But one of the important reasons why we should study history is in terms of what it tells us about the present and the parallels or themes or I'm not keen on the word the lessons, but still, let's say lessons that we learn that maybe help us understand our own experiences and financial crisis, especially the crisis of debt that France faced in 1780s. I think is a good starting point. France was ostensibly one of the most prosperous nations in Europe, and yet it was crippled by a massive debt that was incurred as a result of military conflicts, not as successful as French certainly hoped in the second half of the 18th century. Debt that was incurred as a result of deep inequities that existed in the French society and state, inefficiency, one may say, of the French state, and deeply entrenched sense of privilege that defined the French society of the 18th century, and it is the question of debt and how to service it, what to do with it, that ultimately contributes to the outbreak of the revolution in 1789. Because one way the elites really wanted to deal with the issue of financial crisis was by summoning a representative assembly, the General Estates, and pose that question to it, and effectively seek a moderate reform package that would have allowed France to confront its challenges without violence, without the revolutionary scenario. At the time, no one expected, of course, the revolution. But everyone was convinced, or at least most people was convinced, that reform is the way forward. And I think I want to emphasize that the long-standing myth that the king opposed the reform or the elites opposed the reform, not at all. They were actually in favor of reform. The question was the degree, the extent, the scope, the depth of reform that you would be willing to tolerate. And I think that is still relevant, especially for anyone living in the United States, where I'm, of course, located. The questions of reform in healthcare, reform in government, reform in whatever area, education, whatever area you choose, where is that line that you draw between moderation and radicalism?
And so since this, even the French monarchy was sort of progressive in a way that they wanted to see the reforms, they wanted to improve the society. So what was lacking? What was the thing that they could have done to avoid the revolution at the time?
Well, there are many things that were lacking in hindsight, of course. Now, one of the things that contributed is a disagreement on who is willing to give up the privileges, the vested interests. So, for example, one of the early reforms that King Louis XVI pushed through, or tried to push through, was kind of economic / financial reform to deregulate the flour market. Right. So in France, the internal regime, economic regime, was not based on free trade. Right. It was a very mercantilistic, where each province had its own kind of set of customs and fees that you had to pay once you entered its territory. And in mid 1770s, Louis XVI actually tried to deregulate that. In fact, he opened the market up and bring, shall we say, kind of the forces of supply and demand to play a greater role. Well, the immediate pushback, which was quite actually strong, the immediate pushback came from the vested interest, from the people who were involved in the flour trade and benefited from it. So even though ultimately this reform, if he had stayed, would have benefited the common people by reducing the price of flour and actually dealing with the issues of lack of flour in particular regions when you have the abundance in others, right? And effectively they use the market forces to deal with it. Ultimately, the reform is blocked by the elites, so to speak, by the aristocrats, by the merchants who were involved in it. So part of it was the lack of kind of understanding what the monarchy wanted truly to do. In fact, one of the fascinating parallels is the kind of the campaigns of misinformation or manipulation that characterized the events of 1780s, where even the reforms the government wanted to introduce, which would have benefited the people, were actually portrayed as examples of despotism, as despotic governance on the part of the monarchy. And so the D word was a big thing in contemporary discourse. The fear was that, if you allow the monarchy to get away with this, it will strengthen itself and we'll have a despotism on our hand. So part is that kind of the misperceptions of what reform actually was about. Part of it was, as I said, about the lack of the willingness to collaborate and actually understand the depth of the problem, and willingness to give up something that you have. So that's especially true about the aristocracy, because a lot of the vested privileges and inequalities that we've talked belong to the aristocracy or to the church hierarchy. And for a very long time, they were not willing to compromise. And here, once again, you have the two wings, right, of the party. For example, when the revolution kind of is starting in 1789, and in the spring and summer, early summer, you have moderate, if we use the modern term, liberal nobles, like Marquis de Lafayette, who forms the Committee of 30, who are willing to embrace the moderate package of reform because they understand that's the way forward. It is these moderate liberal nobles who, for example, volunteered to give up their privileges in August of 1789, which is a crucial development in the French Revolution. Another important reason would be the leadership, lack of leadership on the part of the king, and there we get in the issue of the character and personality. There's one of his contemporaries famously put that there is a man who wills and man who knows, and the king knew a lot about the problems. He knew about things that had to be fixed, but at the crucial moments, right? It's not just about knowing, but it's also about willing, kind of willing to enforce it, willing to get together and compromise, whatever. And that willing, the part of the willingness was missing in the king. For example, just as the General States was starting, the king could have played more active role, but his personal hesitancy, but also personal tragedy. His son died in early June, so which made him kind of withdraw from the politics at the moment, meant that the leadership that could have coordinated, right, or the the prestige that associated with monarchy was not there, and so on and so on. I think we can talk a lot about the factors, because that's a complex question.
And did the people involved, like the common people, the working class, did they know what they were fighting for, or were they misled by the leaders of the revolution, so to say, and and the cruelty that came later, the reign of terror and Robespierre and the things that they did? Were people on board with it, or was it planned by the leaders, or did it just go out of hand?
Well, it's again a very complex and kind of broad question, and the reason I'm saying is that remember, it's in the summer of 1789. No one expects terror that will take place just 3 years later or 3.5 years later, because there are a lot of things that were supposed to happen in order to lead us to the terror, and the biggest of them all is, of course, war. War is the catalyst that radicalized the revolution. Without the war, the revolution would have gone in a very different trajectory. The question about the commoners, right, and or as they were classified in France at the time, the third estate. So the third estate in France included everyone who was not clergyman or the noble. So that's an enormous category of people, ranging from the wealthiest, I don't know, Warren Buffett's and Elon Musk's of 18th century France, to people like you and me, and further down on the social ladder, to homeless and beggars and prostitutes and criminals, right? So how do they have that enormous category of people could not have had kind of agreement on all of the issues, right? But they had some agreement on the fundamental issues like they wanted equality before the law. They wanted a greater involvement in the political life of France. They wanted to deal with the issues of inequities and issues of noble or church privileges. The problem is this, and this is where kind of we get in the nitty-gritty, but it's fascinating. So France in 1788 is ostensibly an absolutist monarchy, right, ruled by the all-powerful king. Of course, that's not true. But still, in this winter of 89, monarchy organized remarkable elections to choose this representative assembly, this Estates General. So each estate, the clergy, the nobles, the commoners, had to choose their representatives. And along the way, as they were choosing, and especially when we talk about the commoners, they would choose it at the level of communes, send the delegates to the cities, and then there the communal delegates will choose their representatives. But at each level, they would have to draft what were known as cahiers doléances, that is, a list of grievances. What are the problems that they feel needs to be fixing? So we do know what they wanted. We do know the big issues that they were driven by, and as I pointed out, issues of inequality, issues of political underrepresentation, and so on and so on. But here, Otto, if you had a choice to run for or to vote in a small commune, whether it's in France or United States or in Georgia, who are you going to choose as a peasant? Who are you going to choose as a laborer or a craftsman, artisan? You're not going to choose the local drunk. You're not going to choose one of yours, because you understand that these issues are complex. They require literacy, literally. It requires somebody to be able to read, comprehend, express, give a speech. So who is that person at any given locality? Chances are, I would say, 9 out of 10,
Noble.
It's a lawyer. See, you cannot vote for noble because they vote in a separate estate. But in your estate, it's going to be a lawyer. It's going to be a local merchant. But there is an important difference of experience, viewpoint, and more crucially, interests between, let's say, a peasant and a merchant, between a laborer and a lawyer. Now, at this point in 1789, they think they're in the same boat. They think it's okay if we vote for local lawyer Otto because he will represent it better than a peasant Alex. Down the road, when we get to 1790, so 91, so 2 years into the revolution, when we start talking about fundamental changes, this is where it's important then that your legislative assembly, so essentially your national parliament, staffed from an upper middle class, what we call bourgeoisie, while a lot of the people are from the lower end of the middle class. Now, let me give you a good example of this. So let's say the revolution begins. We are now in the second year of the revolution, and there is an issue of the worker rights. Should the workers have collective bargaining rights? Should they be able to go on strike? As a laborer, I would say, as a worker, let's say, I would say, yes, I should have that right. But you as a lawyer or as a merchant or as a business owner serving in the national parliament, right, in the legislative assembly, will say no, because that will be counterproductive, counter your interests. And so the fact is that in 1791, this revolutionary, ostensibly revolutionary government adopts La Chapelier law that bans workers from organizing trade unions and going on strikes. So how revolutionary is the revolutionary government? So that's the split that we see. And you'll see a lot of splits like this, where the government that is chosen in 89 and then again in 1790 and then again in 91, right, there is an increased disparity between what the members of the national government want, because they come from a specific social strata, as opposed to what the majority of social groups want. And that will contribute to increased radicalization. And of course, then the war, right, which breaks out in April of 1792, changes the entire landscape. And it creates a situation where even crazy ideas that would have been kind of inconceivable just 2 years earlier became real, because you're fighting, at least the narrative is, you're fighting for your own survival. And you're fighting against this enemy, both domestic and foreign, that is bent on destroying the revolution.
And so, what are the consequences of this revolution? Where is France left at by the end of it and by the rise of Napoleon? So, what's the situation like?
France is both in the better and the worse place, let me put it this way. So, if we look at let's do this, 1797 or 1798. 1797, 98. The reason I'm choosing this date is because what we historians call the War of the First Coalition, the first almost pan-European conflict involving France and a coalition of monarchical states, comes to an end, right, in 1797. Where we stand there? Well, we stand where France is actually more powerful than it was before revolution. And this is the legacy of revolution. And the legacy is that because of the war, because of revolutionary developments, a lot of the old regime, the hierarchy of the old regime, and with it, a lot of the problems of the old regime have been smashed to pieces. So think about the administrative structure of France. It's gone. No more provinces, no more intendancies. Now you have départements, centralized, right? The structure of the authority of administrative authority in France was already kind of centralized under the monarchy, but it reached even higher centralization during the Jacobin dictatorship in 1793-94, and then it was remained so in the consequent eras. The French army has gone through a major reform and transformation starting in 1793, when we have a remarkable first modern conscription system introduced by France, which transforms the nature of warfare, because now you are not fighting kind of dynastic, quote unquote, limited war where it's between the rulers, but now France is a nation at arms. It tries to mobilize the entire society and harness the resources of the society for a specific purpose of fighting a war. And it is that truly unprecedented mobilization that allows France to defeat European coalition and go on offensive, so that by 1797, France occupies what is today Belgium, Netherlands, parts of Germany, southwestern Germany, occupies parts of Switzerland, occupies most of Italy. So by the end of this War of First Coalition, France is an imperial republic, stronger than the monarchy that it replaced. And now talking about this vision, it has a wonderful ideology of La Grande Nation, right? The great nation. So what are the hallmarks of the great nation? Well, the great nation brings liberty and reform, brings transformation to the oppressed masses of Europe. But of course, freedom is not free. And if French are coming to bring you that free liberty, they have to be compensated for it. And so we see that regime of occupation that is ostensibly about freeing you, but in practice means exploitation, set up in Belgium, in Netherlands. Classic example what Bonaparte did in Italy, right? His remarkable campaign in 96, 97, defeats Piedmont, defeats Austria, defeats Pope, creates Italian republics, promises this remarkable vision of revolutionary ideals, but on the other hand, also results in material exploitation. Let's call it plunder of northern Italy, with a lot of cultural treasures, not to mention enormous amounts of bullion being shipped to France to maintain the French economy and to enrich the French cultural life. So that's where we are. But at the time when Napoleon comes to power in 1799.
And do you think he was brought to power by the revolution, like because of the revolution? So to say it this way, do you think Napoleon coming to power and in a sense becoming a new sort of a king, of course he became an emperor, but like sole ruler of the country, is that sort of a way to say that Napoleon was returning to the prior order, to the normal of what the world, what was supposed to be at that time?
Yes, of course. And I think it's important to think about Bonaparte both as a byproduct of revolution, but also as an anti-revolutionary. Okay, so let me rephrase that again one more time, because oftentimes Bonaparte is associated with revolution, and many people think of him as a revolutionary figure. But I'm not one of those individuals. So I look at him as a byproduct revolution. The only reason why he was able to accomplish these things is because of revolution. But Bonaparte is inherently rather a counter-revolutionary, so to speak. In my own books, I refer to him as the last of the enlightened despots. A lot of things that Napoleon wants to accomplish as a consul and then as an emperor are in the classical line of enlightened despotism, rational system of government, right, but based on law and order. So Napoleon, of course, we know that he's born in Corsica, right? Would have been just an officer in the French army if not for the revolution. And he benefits from the revolution, but he's also benefits from the enlightenment that kind of underpinned the revolution. And of course, his brilliant campaign in 1796-97, right, made his name a household, or made him a household name across Europe. And it reminds me of the great sentence in Stendhal when he says, that the campaign taught the world that after all these centuries, Caesar and Alexander finally have a successor. Of course, victories in Italy meant more than just a battlefield glory, right? They extended a financial lifeline, as I pointed out. Napoleon raised enormous quantities of financial resources in Italy and sent it to France, right? Stripping the conquered territories of their wealth, filling French coffers, and sending back cartloads of art, treasure. But more crucially, it was in Italy that Bonaparte began to see himself as a man destined for something great. And so he goes on that expedition to Egypt. We know that in 1798, not necessarily of his own choosing, but he certainly is willing collaborator in this. And that campaign in 1798 itself is very interesting because it is the first instance of liberal imperialism, right? It's the moment when we see the revolution transcending the French, in fact, European borders, but it's also a campaign that, for the first time, a nation goes to the east and says, "Hey, I'm here to liberate you, but you are not ready for it yet. So I'm going to bring the freedom stick, and I promise you're going to be free, but until you're free, I'm going to be beating you up with that freedom stick." And so that's what effectively the French army of occupation does in Egypt for 3 years. But Napoleon, of course, escapes and flees in 1799. And when he comes back, right, to France, and this is where it gets to the core of your question, what he finds is a nation, France, that is once again mired in economic malaise, government corruption, effectively reeling from the long effect of the revolution. The ruling government, the Directory, struggled to deal with both internal and external threats. Now imagine if you're a Frenchman and you were 20 years old when the revolution started. So now you are 30 years old, and what have you seen in those 10 years? Well, you've seen utter chaos. You've seen mass purges, executions during the terror. You've seen government amassing a power that would have been unheard of during the monarchy. You've seen plummeting value of government securities, and the paper money that the revolution introduced is literally worthless. By 1798, 99, you would have seen widespread lawlessness, especially in the countryside. Massive domestic rebellions in the east and in the south, in the west and in the south. So, would you be in support of revolution? Maybe, right? Or maybe you would have said, listen, the king sucked, but at least he had the law and order. That's what I would like to have. And you don't have to go far, Otto. We are both, I think you're a little bit younger than me, but I think we are both the offspring of Georgia, and we've seen what Georgia went through in the last 35 years. Right? That cycle of revolution, cycle of chaos, cycle of economic malaise, cycle of assertive, kind of authoritarian government. And what's the reaction from the majority of the people? Again, the majority of the people want a quiet, calm, orderly life, even if it comes at the expense of the civil and political rights. And that's what happens in France in 1799. When Napoleon comes back, he comes back on this promise that if they support him, he's going to deliver law and order. He's going to bring stability back. And after a decade of chaos, after a decade of instability, vast majority of Frenchmen were perfectly fine with an authoritarian government if, and this is a big one, if it delivers on the promise of law and order. So when Napoleon uses the coup, right, the military force to overthrow the government, he sets up a new regime, a regime that is ostensibly constitutional, but it is a unique government because France has the only, at least as far as I know, the only constitution in which individuals are named by name. So imagine if we had a constitution that said, I don't know, President Trump is the president of the United States. This actually is part of the Constitution. So if Trump is not president, as somebody else, you actually have to do a constitutional amendment. So the Constitution of 1800 actually mentions Bonaparte by name as the consul, implying that this guy is there to stay. Of course, Bonaparte delivers on this promise. He promised law and order, he delivers law and order, and he does so by effectively declaring that the revolution is over, by sweeping radical ideology, radical reform in favor of law and order. Financial stability is achieved through aggressive centralization. Lawlessness is reined in with an iron fist. In fact, Napoleon creates this militarized police, gendarmerie, that has actually carte blanche to go after the people who are accused of lawlessness, and we know of thousands of individuals who were shot summarily, I would say, without this due process. And but it is an effective, let me put this way, an effective way of reining in lawlessness. Bonaparte replaces elected officials and local self-governments, which was the hallmark of revolution, with centrally appointed administrators. And effectively, this reconciliation and order became the regime's bywords, right? A new agreement with the Pope, reconciliation with the church, reopens the churches after a decade or almost a decade of persecution, an amnesty for aristocrats, for emigres, for quote-unquote conservatives to return back if they were accepting the new regime, also was very popular. And let me kind of add one more point, I think, which makes Bonaparte very relevant to our modern discourse. Bonaparte pioneered the effective use of plebiscitary referendums, or what we say plebiscitary democracy. And what I mean by this is that he sets up a model where behind the veneer of choice, behind the veneer of universal male suffrage, popular participation, where he actually puts a question to all the voters to consider and answer, right? Behind this veneer, there is this harsh face, harsh reality of an absolutist, of an authoritarian regime that dictates the choice. So people are asked in 1800, do you support the coup? Do you want Bonaparte in charge? People would be asked in 1802, do you want to give this man 10 more years? They will be asked again, do you want to give him the government for life? And each plebiscite ostensibly gives back vast margins of support. Like the plebiscite that gave him 3.5 million yes and 1,562 no. Right? And what it allows him then, right, is to argue that he's not doing it willy-nilly. He's not just doing it himself, but he has a constitutional popular support. So that's a very modern, a very relevant way of doing politics, where you have elections, you have veneer of participation, but you effectively dictate the outcome of those elections.
And what was his character? Have you seen the movie Napoleon that came out recently?
Oh, yeah, I have. I have, and I cried. Let me put it this way. the traversing.
Because there, like, what the impression it left on me was that Napoleon was sort of a simp over women and his wife, and many of the decisions he made at war were in some way influenced by his anger towards his wife or his feelings. I understand it's not historically accurate. So, what's historically accurate description of his character?
Oh boy. So let me maybe start by saying, Ridley Scott, shame on you. As much as I like Ridley Scott's other movies, he has actually produced probably one of the best Napoleonic movie in The Duelists, his first feature film. And for the same guy to produce this atrocity, it's just mind-boggling. No, Napoleon is completely opposite from the one that you see in the movie. Completely opposite. In fact, I actually held a screening of it. I had hundreds of people attend the screening, and at the end of the movie, I said, listen, remember that scene where at the end of the movie, Napoleon returns from Elba and he gives a speech and soldiers switch side? After watching this 3 hours of Napoleon whining and being needy and chasing skirts, would you commit treason for him? No. You would not. So there had to be something to him. He had to have certain charisma, certain strength of character, certain vision to convince hundreds of soldiers on March 5, 1815, at a small village of La Fray, to commit act of treason. So in order to look at the character of Bonaparte, you have to, I've spent how many years now? Since 95, so that's 30 years now. 30 years I've been in his company. In fact, you'd laugh. I don't know if you show the recordings, but he's right there. So he's, yeah, literally in his company. He keeps me here. So I've read almost everything he has written. Certainly most of his letters, most of his writings, most of his documents. And there are certain things I can share with you. So I think he was certainly feared in war, admired in council. And if there was one thing to call him, I think I would call him supreme opportunist. He's pragmaticist of a higher order. Now, he was not the warmonger of the blank legend, and that's what you see oftentimes, especially in the British literature, or to a certain degree in the movies, kind of him being this driven by personal ego. Wars that Waterloo concluded had started when he was still a mere lieutenant, and as I argue in my books, even if Napoleon had been shot dead somewhere in the northern Italy in 96, 97, the wars would have continued. There would have been an authoritarian government in France. The question would have been how successful France, right, could have been, and certainly it would not have been as successful as Napoleon made it. Now, the Napoleon's, there is one of the officers, one of Napoleon's officers. His father asked him when he was young, he wrote a letter, and he asked him, "Who is this General Bonaparte?" And he writes back to his father and says, "You ask me what is this General Bonaparte? To know the answer, one have to become him." The letter states, and I think I like that because in many ways it's hard to understand the complexity of this man. Napoleon himself foresaw this uncertainty of who he was, and he has one of the letters in which he says that I would have, he would have found it very difficult to assert with any degree of truth what was my whole or real intention. Right? Even by the end of his life, he was not certain what he was about. And yet, those who take the time and trouble to survey Napoleon's life and sift, like I've done, through over 40,000 letters that survive from seemingly his never-resting quill, I think they will see a man to whom nothing useful was trivial or dull. To his luminous, really remarkable strength of mind, to its infinite power of concentration, the famous story of him dictating to 5-6 secretaries at the same time. There was no subject, no matter how arduous or remote, that he could not learn or conquer. If Napoleon had found it useful to learn Chinese or Sanskrit, he would have learned it. If he had thought walking tightrope was useful, he would have done it. And when we consider that virtually everything Napoleon knew, he had picked up as he went along, we cannot but being awestruck. For what we witness is not just divine spark, but a true dynamo, is one of his enemies. The great diplomat Talleyrand once put it about Napoleon: he knows everything, he does everything, he can do anything. Now, if there is one character feature that I really admire about Napoleon, and that is his ability to work, his ability to concentrate. In 1816, now in exile on St. Helena Island, he famously tells one of his companions that work is my element. I'm born and built for work. And he says, I've known the limitations of my legs, I've known the limitations of my hands, I've known the limitations of my eyes, but I have never been able to know the limitations of my working capacity. And he's right, because he has this ability to thrive in chaos. He has an ability to arrange the world around him and work for 18, 20 hours without a problem. He can take a 10, 15-minute nap and be as refreshed as we take a long sleep. In the same year, in 1816, he has a wonderful conversation in which he describes his method. He says that kind of when one of the companions asked him how he able to manage an empire that stretched from Portugal to Russia and from Denmark to tip of Italy, and Napoleon kind of famously explains that each object, each business is kind of filed in his mind as in chest of drawers. And he says, when I wish to kind of stop doing one thing and start a new one, he says, I simply go and open the drawer and take the files out. I mean, it's like a mind palace, right? There's a famous mnemonic enterprise. And he says, these drawers never mix with each other. When I'm busy with one, I'm not bothered by the other. And wonderfully, he says, when I want to go to sleep, I simply put all the drawers shut. And I go to sleep. And so this tirelessness, this concentration, this speed with which he could make decisions, and the calculated nature of his character, I think, all make him a very interesting individual. And of course, I can keep going on and on. I mean, there are a lot of aspects of his character that we can touch.
How did he become this military genius? Was part of it the fact that he was a low ranking soldier and he grew to become the general? And did it give him the edge over other high ranking military personnel who were basically high ranking from the birth?
Yes, I think that certainly helped in that he came from the bottom, and he came, and again, and it's a relative bottom. Let me put it this way: we should not forget that he was born into a noble family. Now, granted, by French standard, Corsican nobility is dirt poor. What in Georgia we'll say "Shemot Gomes Azna Urebi," right? Dirt poor nobles. But still, it gave him a leg up because of his social background that he was able to receive very good education. And we oftentimes forget that he went to some of the best schools in existence in the 18th century. That includes the military school at Brienne, but most crucially, it includes the military academy in Paris, the École Militaire, where he studied on a royal scholarship. Now, already at that moment when he's young, right, when he's 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, one thing that you will see is he's very studious. He's very focused on his studies, and he reads voraciously. All his life, he reads. There is a wonderful new study by a great French historian, Charles Louis Vial, on Napoleon and books, Napoleon and libraries, and he shows that Napoleon's personal library is well over 14,000 volumes. If you read his correspondence, you see that he actually, one of the first things he does when he comes to power, he sets up his own personal librarian whose task it is to identify every year the most important books that are published and then put them into his library. And he has two libraries, one kind of at his palace and some of it, or at his house too, at Malmaison, at Fontainebleau. His library still is there, but he also has a portable one, and there's a wonderful letter in which he kind of tells them specification. This is the type of books I want. This is the size. This is how they're going to be arranged, and he has categories: history, philosophy, and all that. And he carries with him about 3,000 books wherever he goes, and he constantly reads. Side of him, that is the side of being an autodidact. Education doesn't stop just because he graduated from a school, from a college, from a university, but rather it's a continuous journey where you constantly acquire new skills, new knowledge, and you cultivate that mindset is truly Napoleonic. It certainly helps that he has that natural ability, right? I already told you he has this natural functioning brain that can classify and categorize things, and he has a remarkable memory, and which you know, which allowed him to make decisions better and faster than most other people. But let me put this, because I think I don't want to, for your listeners to have an impression that I don't see the downsides to Napoleon. We have to also acknowledge that there is a certain level of narcissism that Napoleon has, a certain level of callousness, a certain level of ruthlessness, and that is absolutely clear if you read his letters, in which he casually, for example, is willing to hold entire villages responsible for actions of individuals. There is a famous moment when, for example, there are some Frenchmen in the coastal areas in the western France that are collaborating with the British. And what Napoleon does, he simply takes their entire families hostage, put them in prison, and puts them in a deliberately hostile conditions as a way of telling those men that they have to come back and face the consequences, or their families will, right? So there's a certain level of callousness in terms of how he dealt with the army. In 1813, he famously says that to a man like me, a million death is nothing. And there is a level of hubris that he has. I think ultimately, I'm certainly convinced that it is his hubris that brings him down. He could have compromised in 1812, he could have compromised in 1813 and 14, but he always struggled to bring himself to that, because he always believed that he's better than everyone else, that he could deal with the challenges because he's better, he's smarter, he's more capable. So was Napoleon a good man? Well, there is a famous British historian, Lord Clarendon, and he wrote a biography of Oliver Cromwell, right? Another strong man, right? An English authoritarian, right, from 17th century. And Clarendon famously described Cromwell as the great bad man. And I think that's how I describe Napoleon. There is no denying. Anyone who denies it is just deludes himself or herself. Napoleon is a complex, very talented, very capable man. But there is also no denying that a lot of things that he did are a little bit hard for, especially for anyone living in 21st century, to wholeheartedly subscribe to. And Napoleon himself wondered about his place and role in history. One time he visited Jean-Jacques Rousseau's grave, and he admired Rousseau as a young man. And he kind of stands there, contemplates, and then he says, "Only the future will tell us whether it would not have been better if neither I nor Rousseau had ever been born." And I think in many ways we're still debating that question.
Do you see similarities between French Revolution and the Soviet Revolution? And do you see similarities between Napoleon and Stalin? In a sense that, like, they're both born away from the, let's say, mainland of the empire. They both rise in ranks and become this natural leaders of this unnatural revolution. And then both also in Russia, and so the Soviet Revolution brought down the monarchy, same way it happened during French Revolution, and these two figures both basically become kings and return to that idea of monarchy in a sense.
I think that's a great question, because there are a lot of similarities, in fact, between the French and the Bolshevik. I'm assuming you refer to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917.
Correct. 1917, 1918, yeah.
And the reason, actually, I will say this. One of the reasons is that the Bolshevik leaders, like Lenin, were very keen students of history. Lenin studied French Revolution in detail. If you look at the writings of both him and others, they oftentimes spoke of themselves, and I'm talking about Bolsheviks, as a new day, as a new type Jacobins, because their vision is that kind of creation of a new type of citizen, new type of a quote unquote man. There are certainly similarities in terms of maybe shared structural causes, right? If you enter the structuralist explanation, in France you have a financial crisis, bankruptcy, and then wartime collapse and inflation in Russia. In both cases, you have weak leadership, especially monarchical leadership. So Louis XVI's indecisiveness, Nikolai's, shall we say, competence. There is, of course, the social inequality, right? In both empires, you have highly societies that were based on privilege and high inequality, state system in France and a class structure in Russia. And in both cases, we see regimes, Louis XVI and Nicolas, that both tried limited reform that failed but heightened the expectations. So that's important. I think in terms of the ideology, French Revolution is influenced by Enlightenment, this perception of natural rights, and the Bolshevik Revolution is actually derivative from it. In fact, every revolution of the 19th century, and certainly I count the Bolshevik Revolution as a part of the long 19th century, is inspired, shaped by the experience of the French Revolution. Every revolutionary after 1789, I would specify, after 1815, every revolutionary looked back to the French Revolution for inspiration. Now, there are certain differences, though. So one is that the French Revolution is a really messy affair in which you have multiple factions and leadership changed almost on a yearly basis. Bolsheviks effectively learned from that experience, as this is what makes them so efficient. Because what Bolsheviks do is they borrow they learn what worked for the Jacobins, and what they realized was that the Jacobins, even though they were a minority, were able to dominate this political discourse because they were better organized, better disciplined. And so what we see in the Bolshevik case, and this is effectively the big split that takes place in the Russian Social Democratic Party, right, between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, is a disagreement on how organized this movement is. Should it be a grassroots movement, kind of decentralized, as Mensheviks preferred, or should it be smaller, highly centralized, with a kind of party elite leading the movement, as the Bolsheviks preferred? So there is that difference. Now, in terms of violence and terror, I think there's a similarity because both Jacobins and the Bolsheviks were willing to use terror in this political sense. In fact, it is the Jacobins who invent the modern term terrorism and terror, but in a sense of using political violence to intimidate the opposition. And there's certainly Bolsheviks did the same thing. And we 1920s, not to mention the Red Terror of 1918 to 1922, is all about the extermination of the political opposition, as the Jacobins did. Now, the comparison between Stalin and Napoleon, I see some similarity. You're right, but they both are from periphery. They both are autodidacts, and Stalin, I think we can, if you read the new biographies by Kotkin, you'll see that Stalin is a very keen student of history, of philosophy, and his personal library certainly showcases his close reading of books. to me, the biggest parallel between the two is that they are supreme opportunists, they're supreme pragmaticists. They coldly, very rationally evaluate facts and the circumstances. The big difference I see is that Napoleon, I think, is more capable on a human level, on the personal level, more capable than Stalin, and that Napoleon is not as paranoid as Stalin is. But that's because Napoleon sets up a very different regime from Stalin.
And is Napoleon capable of extent of the cruelty that Stalin displayed?
No, I don't think. Well, to a degree. I mean, we do have examples where he does commit cruelty. Let's say the mass execution of prisoners at Jaffa. Again, you can rationalize it, but I'm sure you would quickly find yourself in the same company as people who rationalize Gulag and mass executions of people in 1930s, right, and justify Stalin's purges. So there is a way always to rationalize it. But yes, no, I think both of them have the ability to be ruthless. But Stalin, of course, is on a level of... Stalin's idea is to create a totalitarian regime that would have been simply inconceivable for Napoleon. Napoleon is not there to create totalitarian regime. He wants to create a regime that is based on rational governance, some use of violence, right? It's targeted use of violence, but overall, Napoleonic system is actually fascinating for its willingness to abide by constitutional framework. That's not something we maybe realize, but Napoleon actually literally wrote or helped create more than a dozen constitutions. That's not something that Stalin... 1936 constitution, sure, I'll give him that. Anyway, so I think politically, their goals are different, but that's because they are products of very different circumstances.
Yeah. So yeah, what I meant was their personalities and their history and their role as in, again, returning this chaos from revolution to a more stable and situation with a sole leader in it.
Well, I do want to point out that, the French Revolution was far more progressive than the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, it establishes the principles of citizenship, secularism, equality before the law. If nothing else, we can quibble about it, but it paves the way for modern liberal democracy. And that's despite or inclusive of imperial interlude that Napoleon presided over. It unleashes nationalism as a political force. So what about the Bolshevik Revolution? Well, Bolshevik Revolution created a one-party, authoritarian, totalitarian system that lasted 70 plus years, that on one hand brought massive modernization, but at a staggering human cost. So, of course, I'm biased, but I like French Revolution more than Bolshevik Revolution. I'm first to admit.
Do you like French Revolution in general?
I like most of it. Let me put it that way. I like most of it. So, and again, as all humans, I'm going through stages. As a younger man, maybe your age, I like the radical stage because it was closer to offering us the vision of modernity. So Jacobin rhetoric, Jacobin ideals of equality, creation of a new citizen, civic virtues, all this I think were more appealing to me as a younger man. But at the time, I would not pay attention as much to terror. Now, as an older man, I'm paying closer attention to terror. And I find myself more disagreeing with people like Marat, right, who argue that it would be okay to behead 100,000 men if that would give Jacobins the ultimate kind of victory. So I do have an issue with that kind of problem resolution.
Yeah, like this, like most of the revolutions I know, they always have this good intentions, and you may like the ideas, but when you see them play out, it rarely plays out the way that it was intended to. Like if you take revolution in Iran, like of course they wanted more freedom, they wanted better lives, but look where it is now and where it was, let's say, like 70 years ago or so.
I agree with that. I mean, there is, in my own lectures, I always, especially in the ones that in the course on the French Revolution, and I teach a separate course kind of on Europe in the 19th century. I tell students that there is a certain pattern that all revolutions go through, and I refer to 5 stages of revolution. So the first stage is kind of old regime is having a problem. It's kind of as Lenin famously put it, right? The elites can't govern, and the bottoms can't really endure it anymore. So there is a fundamental issue of inequality, or fundamental issue of a fiscal problem, or a lost war, or whatever it is. And then you have a campaign, agitation. You have a revolutionary process that needs a spark. It creates, whether it's a fall of Bastille or the code of, the tennis code oath, or maybe in Bolshevik case, right, the February Revolution, and then the summer offensive, whatever it is, right, sparks the revolution that brings the revolutionaries in power. But here's what always happens in the revolutionary process is that revolutions begin as an umbrella movement. There are a lot of different groups are pissed off at the government, and they're angry at the problem, and they want a solution. When the revolution succeeds, and these groups come to power, and they form a provisional government, transitional government, whatever you want to call it, immediately there is realization that this umbrella doesn't exist anymore. Right? We've overthrown the previous government. What seemed to unite us is gone, and now we're discovering that there are a deep, fundamental disagreements between you and me on what is the next course of action. We might have agreed, let's say, we might agree on we need a constitution. Yay! No one says no. But now that we're in power, what is the constitution? What type of government are we going to have? Where do we draw the line of equality? Revolutions, all of the 19th century revolutions is about drawing that line of equality. Do we draw it at the white man? Do we draw it at the rich white man, poor white man? Do we include women? Do we include people of color? That's all the ongoing debate about where's the equality? How do we interpret that equality, right? And then on top of it, do we interpret equality in terms of political equality? What about social, economic equality? And so those are the problems we are still grappling to the modern day, especially in the socioeconomic equality, right? These are the fundamental issues America is facing today. Look at Europe. Look at, in terms of cultural integration, multiculturalism versus more nationalistic discourse. So the issues that the French Revolution effectively opened the Pandora box with are issues that are with us. Some details changed, but the bigger questions are still with us. And that's why studying French Revolution is still relevant. If there is one constant in history, right, as ever-changing as history is, one constant is that human nature doesn't change. Circumstances might, but human nature, we're driven by the same base instincts, base emotions, base desires throughout the recorded part of history. So that's why, let's say, if you read Thucydides and his Peloponnesian War, you can understand the decision-making that Athenians or Spartans or others were making, even though we're separated by 2,000 years and a lot of cultural difference, right? But there is a lot of, on the human level, similarity. And that's why I look at the French Revolution as still very relevant to us, because the problems that revolutionaries faced 200 years ago the problems are still with us, and therefore the way we grapple with them will be maybe not exactly the same, but will be similar, and therefore maybe the outcomes will be similar. So it is well worth examining the past experiences as a way of predicting the future.
If you have time, I'll ask you one more question. What was Napoleon's idea of like creating sort of a European Union at the time? of uniting European states, and how did he look at it, and what was his plan?
Um, so what kind of the ultimate goal, right?
Right.
So the ultimate goal was to create what we can call a universal empire, right? And what do I mean by universal empire? It's an empire that is clearly continental, right? So it's an empire that includes most, if not all, of Europe. And then within that imperial domain, you're going to have certain level of standardization. Napoleon is passionate about it. He's passionate about centralization. He's passionate about standardization. And he believed firmly, but he's not the only one. In fact, if you kind of read the correspondence of almost any Frenchman living through this era, that French way is superior way. It's better. And there's a certain level of chauvinism there, right? So when we talk about this universal empire that would have been created in Europe, it would have been a French-governed, French-led, French-shaped empire because they believed in the cultural superiority. So in this empire, you would have had a common economic sphere, but a common economic sphere that would have served French needs more than others. So yes, you can look at it as a European Union, but a European Union in which one country is so dominant that everything else revolves around it. You would have had one legal system because Napoleon was convinced that French system, based on those great legal codes, was inherently better than what other countries had, and that's why he exported that system to most of Europe. You would have had common currency, or at least the empire was on the way there, kind of with the French franc being universally in circulation. And you will have had a common standard of administration. In fact, if there is one thing that Napoleon does wherever he goes, it's introducing the administrative package of reforms in which French-style administration, French-style tax system, French-style kind of judicial system is exported. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Let me put it this way. Now, some people might accuse me of justifying imperialism. Napoleon does have a point that, for example, Napoleonic Code of 1804 is a better legal system than anything Europe has at the time. It certainly reflects the revolution more than other legal systems. The French administrative system, if you are a proponent of a big government, if you like a government that delivers services, yeah, the French system certainly is very effective. We should not forget that in France, Napoleon creates what he called those big, he calls them the blocks of granite on which the modern French state is based. These are the granites of Bank of France. This is National Archives, Public Treasury, National Vaccination Program, Civil Servants Pension System, Lycée System, the Grand Écoles, which still exist, the Chambers of Commerce, the Labor Accords, the notorious BAC system, where every French student has to pass an exam to graduate from high school, or the cadastre, where the land is assessed and then you pay taxes in proportion to your assessment. All of these are modern. And if Napoleon had ruled long enough, that system would have been exported to all the territories that France controlled. So Europe might have been better off in that way. But the downside, of course, is that the cost of it, right? It came at the cost of military occupation. It came at the cost of massive exploitation. It came at the cost of France effectively being like a vampire state and sucking resources from all the occupied territories. So that's the downside of it.
And just one quick question. You mentioned the vaccines. What sort of vaccines were at that time?
I don't have the medal here, but I would have showed you. I have a collection of Napoleonic medals because Napoleon is one of the most capable, kind of modern style propagandists, right? And for every major initiative, he opens the building, there's the medal, right? And let me kind of show you. Hold on a second. This is the type of medal. So here's the opening of the Bank of France. Well, Napoleon on one side, beautiful bank on the other side. This is the revival of France. Another medal, right? Another beautiful. So in any case, there is one for vaccination. Napoleon creates the first modern national vaccination system where he kind of vaccinates army and citizens from smallpox.
And how was it accepted by people?
It's very interesting, especially by kind of modern parallels, because in a lot of rural areas and especially in places like, let's say, rural Italy, there is a genuine belief that vaccination is part of the government conspiracy to kind of put something into your body that will allow government to control you. So yeah, there is a massive resistance to it, and especially among the quote unquote conservative right segments of society. Church is virulently against it. And again, it is again one of the reasons why history is relevant, right? You can see the problems Napoleon is grappling and the problems we are facing with vaccination and anti-vax movement, and you realize that some things don't ever change.
All right. Thank you for being here. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. Good luck. Kiva tanım, vadlı bakalım. Arap, sarma tebe. Arka.